Jedi Search, Chapter 4. At least the ship didn't explode on impact. That was the first thing Han Solo thought as painful consciousness returned. He blinked his eyes, listened to the hissing of atmosphere streaming through breaches in the Millennium Falcon's hull. Somehow they had survived a crash landing. He wondered what planet he was on. Kessel. His eyes widened as he saw red splashes across the control panels. His own blood. His leg felt as if it were on fire, and he tasted liquid tin in his mouth. As he coughed, more blood splashed out. Han had not managed to strap himself in before the crash. It was a good thing he had not stayed up in the gunwale. From his skewed vantage, he could see that the ship had spun on impact, with the top gunwale crushed beneath them. He hoped Chewbacca had fared better. Turning his head, Han felt as if shards of ground glass were rubbing his spine. In the co-pilot's chair, the Wookiee lay motionless, his pelt matted with discolored blood oozing from wounds hidden by his shaggy fur. "Chewie," he managed to croak, "say something, okay?" Han heard the thud of a small explosive charge on the primary hatch. Then someone from outside managed to hotwire the ramp. The rest of the Falcon's air spurted into Kessel's thin atmosphere. "Great," he mumbled. With the shattering pain in his ribs, it had already been hard enough to breathe. Heavy footsteps marched up the ramp. Han wanted to pull out his blaster or at least knock a few enemies down in a fistfight, but he could barely raise his eyes, expecting to see an orderly column of white-armored stormtroopers. That would be an appropriate end to a day like this. Instead, the intruders wore a hodgepodge of armor, some parts modified from prison guard uniforms, other plates adapted from stormtrooper equipment. None of it made any sense to Han, but his mind had already maxed out with the things that should never have happened. A TIE fighter and an X-Wing fighting side by side against him? The boarding party wore oxygen masks fitted over their faces to let them breathe the thin atmosphere of Kessel. Their voices were muffled as they shouted orders at each other. One man, looking scarecrowish with impossibly long arms and neck, strode into the Falcon's cockpit. Han felt recognition stir inside him, but he couldn't pinpoint a name. The Scarecrow wore armbands from an Imperial prison, but at his side he carried a modified double blaster that was patently illegal on most planets. The Scarecrow turned wide-set, flinty eyes on Han. "Han Solo," he said. Though the breath mask covered his lower face, Han could tell the man was grinning widely. "You're going to wish you never survived landing on Kessel." With a flash of memory, the Scarecrow's name came to Han. Skinksnacks. That was it. But Skinksnacks had been locked up in the Imperial Correction Facility, barely avoiding a death sentence. Questions had just begun forming in his mouth when Skinksnacks brought an armored fist down on Han's head, sending him back into unconsciousness. Kessel, Spice, his thoughts mixed into nightmares as he fought to come back to himself. Han had always been proud to boast that the Falcon had made the Kessel run in record time, but he barely recounted the whole tale. That he had actually been fleeing Kessel with a full load of spice in his secret below-deck compartments when Imperial terrorist ships had tagged him. Han got the shipment, as always, from Morith Duel, the frog-like man in charge of skimming black-market spice from Imperial production quotas. Duel was some sort of official in the gigantic Imperial prison complex, from which came most of the spice mine laborers. The Empire maintained strict control over the spice output, but Duel managed to keep quite a little side market of his own. Han Solo and Chewbacca had run spice for him, whisking it past Imperial patrols and putting it into distribution channels run by gangsters such as Jabba the Hutt. But Morith Duel had a habit of stringing along his helpers until he decided he could gain bigger favor by turning them over to the authorities. Han had never been able to prove it, but he suspected that Duel himself had tipped off the terror ships on the Falcon's flight away from Kessel, providing the exact coordinates where Han planned to enter hyperspace. Han had been forced to jettison his entire cargo of glitterstim spice, worth a fortune, just before being boarded. When Han tried to circle back later and retrieve the floating cargo, the Imperials had given pursuit. During the chase, he had desperately skimmed closer to the gravity influence of the immense black hole cluster than the Navehearts claimed was possible. One of the terrorist ships had been lost in the swirling maelstrom of hot gases plunging into a bottomless singularity. But the Falcon had survived, breaking into hyperspace and fleeing to safety. temporary safety. The lost cargo of spice alone had been worth 12,400 credits, and Jabba the Hutt had already paid for it in full. Jabba had not been pleased. The thought of all those months frozen in carbonite, motionless, hanging on Jabba's wall made him shiver. The cold was black around him, and he couldn't see. His teeth chattered together. "Cease your thermal convulsions," a raspy metallic voice snapped. It sounded like a plasma saw cutting through rock. "The temperature in the medical center has been lowered to minimize surgical shock to your metabolism." Opening his eyes, Han stared up into the bullet-like face of a medical droid. Most of the metal was a primary green, but a black hooded attachment extended over its optical sensors. Segmented mechanical arms reached towards him, displaying a wide variety of out-of-date medical implements, all of them sharp. "I am the prison medical droid. I have not been programmed for anesthetics or the niceties of making you comfortable. If you fail to cooperate, your treatment will only be more unpleasant." Han rolled his eyes back. This was a far cry from traditional medical droids who were programmed specifically with the patient's comfort in mind. Han tried to move. Around him, the prison medical center was white and cold, with gleaming medical appliances and empty Bacta tanks mounted on the wall. Han vaguely sensed several guards standing near the doors. When he turned his head, the medical droid reached out with cold metal hands to clamp against his temples. "You must remain motionless. This will hurt a great deal. Now relax immediately." Out of sight on the other side of the room, Chewbacca let out a roar of pain. Han was relieved to know the Wookiee was still alive. Before treatment, at least. Han winced as the medical droid began to work on him. Chewbacca shook him awake with a hairy, enthusiastic, and grateful hug. Han groaned and blinked his eyes, but the room was so dim he had to stare for a few minutes before anything came into focus. His entire body felt as if it had been beaten instead of healed. Chewbacca groaned and hugged him again. "Take it easy, Chewie. You'll send me back to that medical droid," Han said. Instantly, the Wookiee released his grip. Han mentally assessed how he felt. He sat up, flexed his arms, then got to his feet. 3 of his ribs, as well as his left leg, tingled with the maddening bee stings that indicated where bone knitters had repaired the fractures. Han remained weak, but replacement nutrient solutions had probably brought him back up to nominal levels. Chewbacca also looked scruffy and haggard. Patches of fur had been shaven from his body, and Han could discern lumpy scars where medical droids had made quick patchwork with no finesse. After treatment, the 2 of them had been tossed into this dank place. Finally, Han took a deep whiff of the air inside the chamber. "What died in here?" He suddenly realized that wasn't just a joking comment. Chewbacca answered by pointing to the hulking form that occupied a third of the space in the cell. He blinked again to be sure his vision was adjusting properly. The thing was huge and hideous. Part crustacean, part arachnid, and judging from the rows of dagger teeth, entirely carnivorous. Its claw hands were as big as a human was tall, and its jointed body armor was covered with scab-like bumps. The only good thing about it was that it was dead. The carcass reeked. The first time Han had been near a Rancor, he had been blind from hibernation sickness after being thawed in Jabba's palace. Jabba fed the monster below his throne room with his enemies, or anyone else at random. Han had seen many more Rancors on the planet Dathomir during his courtship of Princess Leia. One of the beasts had somehow died here in the Imperial Correction Facility. The Rancor had decayed as far as it was going to, and then mummified the rest of the way. The prison itself, from what Han knew of it, was a cross between a zoo and a correctional facility, because the different life forms had different degrees of sentience. The only factor in common was that they were all violent. Their cell was gigantic, as far as cells went, large enough to hold the Rancor and give it room to maneuver. Brittle, moldy bones lay scattered around the floor, many of which had been gnawed and pulverized, as if in a desperate attempt by the starving Rancor to find more food. Green and blue smears of slime oozed down the walls. Tiny, dripping sounds were the only noises Han could hear. "How long have we been here, Chewie? Do you know?" Chewbacca did not know. Han ran over it again in his mind. They had come to Kessel. They had identified themselves both by name and with the New Republic call sign. A fleet of ships had come out to attack them. TIE fighters and X-Wings, and a motley bunch of other ships. Obviously, the people in charge of Kessel were up to something, and they didn't want the New Republic to know about it. Then he remembered Scarecrow-like Skinksnacks, who had boarded the crashed Falcon. Skinksnacks had been a thief and an assassin, the primary point of contact between Morith Duel and the spice smugglers. Skinksnacks had wrangled a nominal post as a prison guard in the correction facility, but now he seemed to have changed jobs. Han heard the click and hum of the deactivation field around the cell doors, and then a grating whir as hydraulic lifts hauled the huge door upward. As the door raised, garish white light flooded into the room. Han clapped a hand over his eyes. He hadn't realized the cell was so dim. "Get ready, Chewie," Han whispered. If there weren't too many guards, they could rush them, slug their way out, and escape. But then he felt a twinge of pain from his recently broken ribs, and dizziness washed over him. Chewbacca leaned weakly against one of the damp walls of the Rancor cell and groaned. "Well, maybe if there's only one guard who has poor eyesight and is recovering from weeks' worth of dysentery. Never mind, Chewie. Let's see what they have to say." The skeletal figure standing in the door was obviously Skinksnacks. As Han's eyes adjusted to the light, he could see 4 other guards behind Skinksnacks, wearing not quite prison uniforms, patches of body armor to protect sensitive areas but showing no rank or insignia. "So, Han Solo, I trust you appreciate our hospitality?" Skinksnacks asked. Han smirked and looked behind him at the dank cell, the dead Rancor. "Yeah, you guys are really turning Kessel into a resort world, just like the planet Ethor." Skinksnacks followed his gaze to the mummified monster. Yes, during the turmoil when we took over the prison, someone forgot to feed the Rancor. It was a pity months passed before we remembered him. A double pity, too, because by the time we thought of him, we had plenty of Imperial prisoners we needed to dispose of. That would have been fun to watch. Instead, we had to send them all into the spice mines. Skinksnacks smiled for just an instant. Then his face took on its flat mechanical composure again. I hope the medical droids helped you recover from your crash injuries. It's important that you both are healthy enough to withstand interrogation. We want to learn exactly why you came to spy on Kessel. It occurred to Han that for once he could actually tell the truth and be completely open about his mission. "Ready when you are, Skinksnacks." Somehow he was afraid the truth wouldn't be good enough in this case. The gangly man allowed another flash of a smile. "So you do remember me, Solo. Good. Morith Duel will want to talk to you immediately." Han raised his eyebrows. That meant Duel was still alive, still running things, but Han had no idea how the pieces fit together. "I'd love to talk to old Morith. It's been a long time. He was a good buddy of mine." Skinksnacks snickered at that, then stopped. The other guards behind him also chuckled. "Yes," Skinksnacks said, "I do believe I've heard him mention your name several times." The lift took them out of the main cell block areas, along a tube to the outer corners of the correctional facility. They rocketed skyward along the angled metal tracks. Looking through the scratched, transparent walls of the elevator, Han could see that the prison itself was a massive tan and gray edifice made of plasteel and synthetic rock. The flat front face sloped backward at about a 45-degree angle. Elevator turrets glided along each of the corners. A glassed and mirrored substructure protruded from the slanted face, housing the administrative offices and prison personnel. In the racing elevator car, Skinksnacks watched both of them with flickers of amusement, keeping his modified double blaster trained on them. The 2 guards, armed with more conventional weapons, also stood tense and ready. Seeing this, Han felt ironically impressed. He didn't know what he had done to instill such fear in these people. Both Han and Chewbacca had been strapped into stun cuffs, a restraining fixture across the wrists that sent paralyzing jolts of electricity directly into the nervous system, proportional in strength to the amount of struggle a prisoner exerted. Han controlled himself well enough and only received unpleasant tingling along his forearms. As usual, Chewbacca could not keep his temper in check and managed to stun himself into a stupor. When the elevator doors opened, Skinksnacks prodded the 2 prisoners forward. Han complied and walked easily ahead, trying to put a self-confident spring in his step. He'd had his troubles with Morath Duel, and he did not trust the man a bit, but as far as he knew, there was no powerful grudge between them. Skinksnacks escorted them through administrative offices, many of which had been ransacked or burned. They went past a broad anteroom to a huge office faced by giant windows that looked out upon the barrens of Kessel. In the distance, Han could see the crumbled salt flats. Great jets from the atmosphere factories sent gouts of oxygen, nitrogen, and carbon dioxide into the pinkish sky, keeping the planet barely habitable. Powerful radiation shields in orbit filtered out a large percentage of the deadly X-rays and gamma rays pouring from the nearby maw. If not for the precious spice, no one would bother trying to live on Kessel. The original sign on the desk unit announced this to be the warden's headquarters, but someone had crossed out the previous ID tag and mounted a hand-lettered sign in BASIC, Duel's Place. On the wall to the right of the desk unit hung a man captured in final throes of agony, frozen in carbonite. Duel had taken a lesson from Jabba, displaying some old enemies for all to see. Han shivered just to look at the trophy. Next to the window, a barrel-shaped form stood silhouetted by the garish light. Han recognized Morath Duel immediately. Duel was a Rybat, squat and soft-skinned. His bright green coloring and tan highlights looked like worm stripes up and down his cheeks, arms, and shoulders. His skin was dry, but so smooth it looked slimy. As always, Duel dressed in the skins of less fortunate reptiles. His waistcoat looked like something from an ancient history vid. Duel sported a bright yellow cravat, which meant he was in mating readiness, though Han couldn't imagine where on the planet Duel would ever find a willing female of his own species. Duel turned around, displaying a much-changed face, jittered with nervous tics and paranoia. His right-eyed eyes were overlarge, lantern-like with vertical slits, but one of his eyes was now milky white, like a half-cooked egg. He wore a mechanical focusing device over his other eye, strapped into his smooth head with brown leather straps. Duel fiddled with his mechanical eye, and the lenses clicked and whirred into place like a camera unit. His Rybat fingers were long and white at the end, showing signs of vestigial suction cups as he adjusted the focus and pressed his face closer to Han's. The blind eye stared milkily off in another direction. After a long inspection, he finally hissed in recognition.
"It is you, Han Solo."
Han frowned. Been hitting the spice too heavily? I see, Morath. Always gets the eyesight first.
"It wasn't spice that did this,"
Duel snapped, tapping the contraption on his eye. He drew in another long, sputtering breath that sounded like a carbonated drink spilled on hot coals.
"Why are you here, Solo? I want you to tell me. But maybe I want you to resist just a little bit so I can make this hurt."
Chewbacca roared in anger. Han tried to spread out his hands, but the stun cuffs zapped him. "Wait a minute, Morath. You'd better explain a few things to me. I don't quite know." Duel didn't hear him, rubbing his splayed hands together and smiling with his squishy lips.
"The hardest part is going to be restraining myself from having you dismembered right here where I can watch."
Han felt his heart pound. "Can we be reasonable for just a minute? We were business partners, Morath, and I never crossed you." Han didn't mention his suspicions that Duel had crossed him in that last spice run. "I apologize if I did something to upset you. Can we work it out?" He remembered his conversation with the hitman Greedo in the Mos Eisley Cantina. Once offended, Jabba the Hutt had never been interested in working anything out. He hoped Duel would be more reasonable. Morath Duel stepped backward, fluttering his long-fingered hands.
"Work it out? What are you going to do? Buy me a droid replacement for my eye? I hate droids. Because of you, Jabba tried to have me killed. I had to beg them to take only my eye. I had to beg them to take my eye."
He jabbed at his boiled egg blind side. Skinksnacks shambled closer to Duel, lowering his voice. "I think you're confusing him rather than frightening him, Morath. Maybe he really doesn't know what happened." Duel sat down at his desk and straightened his lizard waistcoat, regaining his composure.
When you dumped your load of spice, Jabba blamed it on me. He put out a contract on my life. Oh, because of your cowardice.
Chewbacca roared in outrage. Han barely kept his anger in check. Jabba put out a contract on me too, Duel. Greedo tried to assassinate me on Tatooine. Boba Fett captured me on Bespin and I was trapped in carbonite, just like your friend there. He gestured to the gruesome trophy on the wall. And I got sent to Jabba anyway. Duel waved a hand in dismissal.
Jabba's men already infiltrated the spice mining operations, and he wanted to expose me, so his own people could procure the glitter stem directly. One of his hitmen fried my eye and half blinded the other. He was about to do more, but Skink's Necks killed him.
At the doorway, the Scarecrow smiled with pride.
Jabba forced my hand, and I had to act. We staged the prison revolt. The warden himself was Jabba's man, but half the guards were on my side. I paid them well, you see. Jabba forced my hand, and I had to act. We staged the prison revolt. The warden himself was Jabba's man, but half the guards were on my side. I paid them well, you see. Luckily, the Empire was thrown into chaos right about the same time. We took Kessel for ourselves. There were a few other upstart slave lords on the other side of the planet, but they didn't last long. I've been stockpiling spice supplies and building up a massive defense fleet with everything I could scrape together. Nobody, and I mean nobody, is going to come here and take things away from me.
Duel grabbed his head with his long fingers in a gesture of weariness.
Everything was going just fine before you had to get Jabba angry at me. Everything was safe. I knew just how to play the game. And now I'm jumping at shadows, afraid every moment.
Duel stared at Han with his mechanical eye.
But ruining my life once isn't good enough for you, is it? You've come back here broadcasting a message from the New Republic. Somehow I thought remnants of the Empire would try to grab the spice mines back first. But big governments are all the same. You are a spy, a particularly inept one. Do you think you could just fly into our space, look around, and go back to your republic with all the information they need to come take us over?
He slapped his palm on the desktop with a damp splat.
We'll strike the first blow by killing their spy, and we will be ready to blast them out of the sky the moment your attack ships come out of hyperspace.
You haven't got a chance, Skinksneck sneered. Han allowed himself to smile, then actually chuckled. You boys have got it all wrong. Absolutely wrong. Chewbacca grunted his agreement. Skinksneck scowled. Duel stared at Han in silence for a moment.
We'll see about that.
Duel reached into the pocket of his waistcoat and withdrew a small, ancient-looking key, which he inserted into one of the drawers of the former warden's desk. He fumbled with the lock, then opened the drawer. Reaching in, he pulled out an armored strongbox. He hefted the strongbox to the table, then dug in another pocket of his waistcoat to extract a second key. Han watched, his curiosity piqued, as Duel opened the strongbox and withdrew a smaller, sealed container. Duel meticulously slipped both his keys back into his pockets before looking at Han.
I'd like to spend some time interrogating you thoroughly, but I want to know exactly when the New Republic plans to come in and take over, how many ships they are sending, what type of forces they will use. I'll get the information now, but I may have time to enjoy interrogating you later, just on general principle.
Duel placed his webbed rybat palm on the top of the sealed container. With a slight hum, a beam of light curled around his fingers in an ID scan. The small container burped as the airtight seal was broken. The lid slid away to reveal a padded interior compartment. The box was filled with slender, black-wrapped cylinders about half as long as a finger. Han recognized them immediately.
"Glitter stim,"
he said. Duel looked at him.
"The most potent form of spice. With it, I'll be able to read the truth of what you say. Your errant thoughts will betray you."
Han felt a sudden sense of relief.
"But what if I don't have any hidden thoughts to betray?"
Skinksnack struck Han's head with the back of his hand, sending him reeling. Chewbacca tried to stagger forward, but the stun cuff silenced his bellows and made him sway dizzily, barely able to keep his balance. Duel selected one of the slim black cylinders and held it in his fingers. With a deft motion, he peeled off the opaque outer wrapper and withdrew a thin bundle of transparent, glassy fibers. As Duel held the inert glitter stem up to the light pouring through the broad viewing window, the light-sensitive spice began to scintillate and glow from within, ripening. Han watched until it was ready for Duel to consume. He swallowed a dry lump in his throat. Duel opened his mouth when the segment of glitter stem glowed a pearlescent blue. He extended his sharp purplish tongue to wrap around the crystalline fibers, which he drew back into his mouth. The glitter stem crackled and fizzed. As Duel flexed his lips, tiny sparkles seeped out of the corners. Han stared as Duel closed his blind eye and breathed deep, watery breaths. The spice would act on Duel's mind, pump up his latent powers. The automatic focusing gears of Duel's mechanical eye clicked and whirred, spinning around as it tried to make sense of the visions pouring through the Rybat's mind. Then Duel turned his face to Han and Chewbacca. Han winced as he felt tiny fingers clawing around in his brain, picking through the lobes of memory, images he had stored in his thoughts, searching. He tried to shrink away, but he knew he could keep no secrets from anyone pumped on Glitterstim. Skinksnacks chuckled, then immediately fell silent, as if afraid of directing Duel's attention to himself where his own brain could be picked. Han felt anger growing, outrage that Morath Duel could dissect the private moments he had with Leia, could observe the births of Han's 3 children. But the spice effects lasted only a few moments, and Duel would be concerned mainly with learning why Han and Chewbacca had come to Kessel.
"I was telling you the truth, Duel," Han said quietly. "We are on a peaceful mission to re-establish diplomatic contact with Kessel. The New Republic is trying to open up trade and welcome you. We came in peace, but you just declared war on yourself by shooting down their first ambassadors." Chewbacca growled. Skinksnack stiffened, then took a few awkward steps forward.
"What is he talking about?"
Han raised his voice. "Read the truth in my mind, Morath."
The Rybat's mouth hung slack, and Han could see Glitterstim sparks sputtering around his cheeks. He felt the tiny probing fingers crawl deeper and deeper into his mind, scrabbling around. Duel was frantically trying to find some proof of his suspicions as the spice enhancement faded away. But Duel could find nothing. There was nothing to find. The only thing he did learn was the power of the Alliance forces that would be arrayed against him. A fleet that had succeeded in overthrowing the entire Empire would certainly be sufficient to destroy a ragtag outlaw operation on Kessel.
"No!"
Duel wailed. He whirled to glare at Skinksnacks.
"What are we going to do? He's telling the truth."
He can't be," Skinksnacks said. He's...
"The spice doesn't lie. He's here for exactly the reason he said. And we shot him down. We took him prisoner. The New Republic's going to come after us. They'll wipe us out."
"Kill the 2 of them now," Skinksnacks said. "If we work fast, we can cover everything up." Han felt sudden fear return.
Now, wait a minute. I'm sure we could fix this with a few careful messages. I am the ambassador, after all. Diplomatic credentials and everything. I wouldn't want a simple misunderstanding.
"No," Skinksnacks said, keeping his attention fixed on Duel. "We can't risk that. You know what Solo has done before. He knows you tipped off Imperial terror ships to go after him." Actually, Han hadn't been certain until that very moment.
"Now there's no need to panic," he said again. I can talk to the New Republic Senate. I know Mon Mothma personally, and my wife Leia is a cabinet member, and... His mind whirled, trying to think of how Leia would handle this. Many times he had watched her smooth diplomatic problems. She had a finesse with words, a way of approaching other people's concerns and stroking them, delicately maneuvering opposing sides into a compromise. But right now, Leia wasn't with him.
Yes, I think I agree,
Duel said, tapping a finger against his swollen lips. Han let out a sigh of relief.
I agree with Skink's Necks. I'll review the battle tapes, but I don't believe you transmitted any messages after coming out of hyperspace. One of our fighters shot off your subspace antenna dish. The New Republic has no way of knowing you arrived safely. With no evidence, they will conclude you got swallowed up by the maw.
Duel began to pace in front of the large viewing window.
We'll delete any mention of you from our records. Instruct all my mercenaries to forget about the attack. Yes, that will be the safest alternative.
You're making a big mistake, Han said. He could barely restrain his urge to yank at the stun cuffs.
No,
Duel replied, tapping his squishy-tipped fingers together.
I don't think so.
Chewbacca bellowed a loud string of guttural words.
My best bet would be to kill you right away,
Duel answered. Then he rubbed his fingers against his blind eye.
But you still owe me for this, Solo. Even if you worked every day for 100 years, it would never repay me for the loss of my eye. You both are going down into the spice mines, the deepest and most distant tunnels. They've been needing quite a few replacements lately.
Duel grinned with his wide, frog-like mouth. A final flicker of blue sparks rippled at the corner of his lips.
No one will ever find you down there.